Hey friends, welcome or welcome back. My name is Shannon, and today we're going to talk about three nonfiction books that I've read over the past couple of months. Since we are in November and we celebrate here on BookTube Nonfiction November, where people try to read more nonfiction. So the first book I want to talk about is Three Cups of Deceit: How Greg Mortenson, Humanitarian Hero, Lost His Way by Jon Krakauer. Now, I picked this up because I was looking for a very short audiobook. I was going on a 3 to 4 hour drive, and this audiobook was approximately 3 hours. In addition, I had read Greg Mortenson's book, Three Cups of Tea, a couple, maybe about 10 years ago or so. And so I wanted to see what Jon Krakauer had to say about this. And so Krakauer is a mountaineer, a journalist, and a nonfiction author of books such as Into the Wild and Into Thin Air. I've never read anything that he has written before, so this is the first Krakauer book I've read. And because of Krakauer's mountaineering, he came into contact with Greg Mortenson, who is the author, like I said, of Three Cups of Tea, which was published in 2006. And in Three Cups of Tea, Mortenson recounts his life. He was a registered nurse and a mountaineer, and he talks about his transition from nurse slash mountaineer to a humanitarian, building schools for girls in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And he also co-founded the Central Asia Institute, which is a nonprofit that has reported building many schools in these areas since its founding. According to Three Cups of Tea, Mortenson came up with the idea of building schools during an expedition to K2, which I guess is the world's second highest mountain. And during this expedition, he got lost when he was coming down the mountain, and his life was saved by this local village. And to thank this local community, he promised to build a school. The book then goes into details on the difficulties of building schools in areas that were ruled by the Taliban. You've got to raise money, you're in a remote location, there are political issues, and then there was long periods away from his family. And supposedly at one point, Mortenson was even captured by the Taliban, as he recounts this in his book. I had read Three Cups of Tea a few years after it had come out. So if it came out in 2006, maybe I read it in 2008, 2009. So I guess more than 10 years ago. And although I really liked what he was doing, and I thought he was doing was really great, I was actually, and I distinctly remember being put off by the tone of the book. I felt that Mortenson was just way too full of himself for my taste, regardless of all the good work he was doing. I thought that was great. He was building schools for girls and in these remote locations that didn't have education, or they were afraid of the Taliban, or whatever. I thought everything he was doing was great, but I just wasn't jiving with the tone. And I don't know if that was Mortenson's fault or the co-writer's fault. And I honestly cannot even remember the name of the co-writer of Three Cups of Tea. So that being said, Krakauer had donated hefty sums of money to the Central Asia Institute, but at some point Krakauer didn't like how the Institute didn't actually tell you where the money was going. And so this prompted Krakauer to investigate the Central Asia Institute, and particularly Greg Mortenson. And in this Krakauer's book, he's basically disputing many of Mortenson's accounts of his experiences in Afghanistan and Pakistan, including his supposed capture by the Taliban. And Krakauer also accuses Mortenson of mishandling funds. And unfortunately, in Krakauer's book, I felt like he was being a little one-sided. It seemed like his sole purpose was to bring Mortenson down instead of being more journalistic and maybe give two sides of the story. But he didn't spend really a whole lot of time on the schools that Mortenson had built and the good things that he had done, albeit it may not have been as much as Mortenson had claimed. And some of the stories that he recounted in his book were most likely heavily embellished. And he Mortenson probably was mishandling funds, whether it was intentional or unintentional, I'm not really sure. But Krakauer, it seems to me in this book, Krakauer had one track mind. He just wanted to bring Greg Mortenson down and find out where all of the money was going that was being donated to the Central Asia Institute. Fair, if I'm donating, $100,000 to a nonprofit, I want to make sure that the money that I'm giving is going to the appropriate place. I would say this book by John Krakauer was great for my car ride. It was quick. It was, it passed the time. But I would say this isn't a must read. And I would also say you don't even have to read 3 Cups of Tea. But, if you don't mind the pretentious tone that Greg Mortenson has, maybe you will like 3 Cups of Tea. But this just wasn't, my cup of tea. Mortenson was later investigated and charged by the Montana Attorney General. Mortenson lived in Montana, and it was determined that he had misspent $6 million of the Institute's money. He wasn't criminally charged, and he was ordered to repay $1 million to the Institute, and I believe Mortenson did retire from the Institute in 2015. Next, we have The Wager, a tale of shipwreck, mutiny, and murder by David Grann. I also listened to this on audiobook. And this is the story of the HMS Wager, which was an English Navy ship that set out in 1741 as part of an 8-ship squadron to attack a Spanish treasure ship off the coast of Chile. And in order to get to the Pacific, to the coast of Chile, they had to round Cape Horn. And during this rounding, the Wager was separated from the rest of the squadron during a storm, and they were wrecked on an island, which would later be called Wager Island. The crew mutinied against Captain David Cheap and also abandoned him with a few loyal crew members on that island, and managed to set off from the island in some sort of modified boat, and they were heading towards Portuguese-controlled Brazil. Many of the mutineers died or were otherwise abandoned, but a few did actually make it to Brazil and then eventually returned to England. Now, during this whole mutiny, a few of the original mutineers had turned back. They didn't feel comfortable with what they were doing, and then they actually returned to the island to Cheap. And one of those would-be mutineers who did return to Captain Cheap was John Byron, who was the grandfather of poet Lord Byron. Cheap and his crew had made several attempts to try to get off the island, and they did eventually succeed with the help of some indigenous, I believe it was the Chonos tribe, who helped guide them into Spanish-controlled Chile. Now, because they were kind of at war with Spain, they were held in captivity by the Spanish, but eventually were returned to England approximately 2 years after the original mutineers had returned to England. And those original mutineers who had returned to England had already become like a national sensation and had already told their stories to the Navy and to the public. Now, nobody had dreamed that Cheap and the other people that they had left would return. So this was absolute craziness. It was a public sensation. There were many books that were written about the experiences, and there was also a court-martial. Mutiny was a very serious issue and was punishable by death. This book is narrative nonfiction, and the way that Grann writes, you almost forget that this is nonfiction, and it's like a story, and especially when he uses first person narrative, and a lot of the sources that he uses are the first person narratives of the people who were there, who survived, and who actually wrote down their experiences. Specifically, Lord Byron's grandfather, John Byron. He wrote several accounts and kept detailed notes of everything that had happened. And even one of the mutineers had kept detailed notes of what had happened. I enjoyed this for the information that Grann provided on British imperialism of that time, and also the information that he provided on the Navy hierarchy, which kind of was no different than the social hierarchy of the time. The better born you were, the higher positions you got in the Navy, regardless of whether you knew anything. And that being said, the Navy at that time was beginning to be a place where lower born men were able to distinguish themselves and raise their social class. So it was a way to socially climb. 70 years later, when Jane Austen was writing Persuasion, you know me, I love Jane Austen. I always have to bring something around to Jane Austen. So years later, a generation later, Jane is writing Persuasion. People were still a little peeved that low-born men could socially climb via the Navy. If you remember, if you've read Persuasion, Sir Walter in Persuasion doesn't want a Navy man in his house because the Navy tends to bring, quote, persons of obscure birth into undue distinction. So the Navy at the time in the 1740s and continuing into Jane Austen's time, people were able to socially climb. This story also shows the human condition when put under such severe strain and deprivation and the things that we humans will do just to survive. At first, when they were shipwrecked on the island, they try to adhere to the social hierarchy and naval law in order to maintain some sort of decency and civilization. But as the food runs out, and as hope runs out, hope that they're going to get off that island, there was violence, there was faction splitting off, and then eventual mutiny and abandonment. But the crazy thing about this story is that two separate groups from this shipwreck eventually made it back to England and were able to tell their stories. And I enjoyed the audiobook. It was quite short, about 8 hours, and it was perfect for my commute and for doing some chores around the house and for cooking. So I'm glad I didn't actually purchase a physical copy of this. The audiobook for me was perfect. My favorite book in this video is 90s Bitch, Media, Culture, and the Failed Promise of Gender Equality by Allison Yarrow. Now, if you are not a person who enjoys swearing in your videos, please feel free to drop off now because I am going to be using the term bitch very often in this video. I mean, it's in the title. So if you're not into that, no hard feelings, and please feel free to drop off, and I will see you in the next one. Okay, so 90s Bitch. I also listened to this on audio. I'm really getting into my audiobook era. I'm really enjoying it. But because I was listening to the audio and I was like, oh my God, I need to write this down. I need to highlight this. I had to purchase the book so that I could annotate it and go through it in more detail. If you came of age in the 90s, I definitely think you will appreciate this book. So Yarrow is a journalist, and this was published in 2018 as kind of a response in trying to understand how we got to a place where in 2016 we elected a confessed sexual predator as president. Now I'm filming this just a few days after Election Day, and we have elected that same sexual predator again. Yarrow argues that we laid the foundation for our current culture in the 90s before we dived headfirst into internet culture. So despite the advancements of women in the 60s, 70s, 80s, the 90s wanted to subordinate the women who had gained too much power, or who were too angry, who were too sexy, too ambitious, too fat, too thin, too pretty, too ugly, too hot, too cold. Okay? So women have been called bitches since the ancient Greeks. So This is not a new phenomenon, all right? And the intent was to reduce women to their sexual function. Basically, a dog in heat who begged for sex. The ancient Greeks actually coined this in reference to the virgin goddess Artemis, who was a huntress who changed herself into a wild dog. According to etymologists, the word has been always used with the intent of, quote, suppressing images of women as powerful and dividing and equating them with sexually depraved beasts. That was always the intention from the ancient Greeks through today. From the beginning, meant to restrain women. Currently, we throw the term around. Sometimes it's serious, sometimes it's not. Women are trying to reclaim the term back. Sometimes we use it as an endearment. You've got boss bitch, and I often talk about my resting bitch face. So we throw the term around, but it always has been a serious term. And I think at one point, maybe in like Victorian times, it was being called a bitch was worse being called a whore. Yarrow also coins the term bitchification, and she uses this term to describe how the 90s media and our societal narratives have, once again, reduced women to their sexual function in order to prevent more progress. And there was an article from Randall Browning from the Los Angeles Review of Books who sums up Yarrow's term bitchification as, quote, a sociocultural process by which a woman makes headlines, breaks patriarchal mores, is judged by her sexuality, and then sees her credibility and reputation shattered. Yarrow goes into painstaking detail of the media debacles of women such as Tonya Harding, Monica Lewinsky, Anita Hill, Janet Reno, Nicole Brown Simpson, Marsha Clark, Shannon Doherty, Hillary Clinton, Pamela Anderson, Anna Nicole Smith, Amy Fisher, Lorena Bobbitt, the list goes on. You all remember this from the 90s. If you were around in the 90s and you were a teenager or an adult, you remember the debacles. Anita Hill was too cold to be credible, and she was a scorned woman. Okay, Monica Lewinsky was too fat and too sexual. Janet Reno was too unfeminine. Women of color were maligned even more. Angry white women like Alanis Morissette and Jagged Little Pill, that was unacceptable. But angry black women like Lisa Left Eye Lopez were feared even more. So they were maligned even more in the media. Now, girls of the 90s were promised equality and empowerment. Our mothers and grandmothers didn't burn their bras or fight for abortion and birth control rights for nothing. And we in the 90s, we had girl power and riot girl, but even those couldn't withstand the attacks. And by the end of the 90s, both those movements were diluted and essentially commercialized. Quote, where Riot Girl had used anger and disobedience to fight for social justice, girl power revered signifiers of girliness, especially those that could be purchased. Fashion trends like lace, bows, knee socks, pigtails, baby tees, baby doll dresses emerged to celebrate the sexy little girl. Instead of forcing change, girl power infantilized and sexually objectified its crusaders. So basically, nobody was winning. Okay. Even though we were trying to take our sexuality back, we were still infantilized and sexualized. Now, this book may almost seem nostalgic if you're reading it. In addition to the real life scandals that Yarrow covers here, she talks about tons of television shows and movies and musicians from the 90s that helped perpetuate the subjugation and how the media portrayed women and told women's stories. I found myself going like, oh my God, I remember this. Oh my God, I remember that throughout the whole book. But be careful if you do read it that, yes, it may seem nostalgic, but it's a little bit darker than that. She talks about shows such as 90210, The Real World, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Murphy Brown, Living Single, Sex and the City, Ally McBeal. She talks about musicians such as the Spice Girls, Fiona Apple, Gwen Stefani, Paula Cole, Meredith Brooks, Courtney Love. Movies such as Fatal Attraction, Kids. Y'all, you remember Kids? Oh my God. I mean, she talks about how all of those shows and musicians and movies perpetuated this subjugation, whether intentionally or no. And I remember all of this happening in real time. And I spent the book pretty much in like a rage. I was like, oh my God, I remember that. That was so awful. And, because I just remember, and I remember how unfair it was. And I remember saying, why is this happening? Why are they treating her like this? Why is this, and then in looking back, I also probably perpetuated some of this. I'm sure I looked down on other women for how they were, maybe too sexual or not sexual enough. I was one of those girls who thought I was cool because I was listening to Tori Amos and Alanis Morissette and Courtney Love and Fiona Apple, the angry girls who are taking back their sexuality, stick it to the man. Yet I was probably most likely looking down on Britney Spears for, Baby One More Time in her pigtails and her Catholic school outfit, and using her sexuality not to stick it to the man, but just because to make money. There is no doubt in my mind that I helped perpetuate this. So Yarrow throws it back on us as well. she's pulling no punches here, and she is not sparing anybody. If, like I said, I enjoyed this. I enjoyed listening to the audio, but I actually had to pick this up because I plan on going through this and just highlighting all of the things. So if you were a teenager or adult in the 90s, if you came of age in the 90s, or if you didn't, if you're younger and you want to know why your mother's so crazy, pick this up. And you'll see all the things that we had to deal with, all the messages that we were fed during this time. So that's it. 3 nonfiction books that I've read over the past few months. And let me know if you've read any of these. And if you have, let me know what you thought of them. And if you enjoyed or you disliked or you disagree with any of my thoughts here, please let me know. I would love to hear from you. That is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining, and have a great day. Bye.